This episode is sponsored by Masterclass. Though it is really important to know stuff, Masterclass's world-famous instructors show you how to do what's important to you. When I set out to prepare for this podcast almost exactly 1 year ago, I knew that I needed to get better at writing. That's where one of my favorite authors, Malcolm Gladwell, came in. Masterclass makes it possible for me and others wanting to improve their writing to take a class from Malcolm Gladwell on writing at our own pace. You can watch and in many cases listen to awesome instructors like Malcolm Gladwell teach you how to do what's important to you. You want to be a better cook? Gordon Ramsay teaches you how on the Masterclass platform. You want to learn how to act? Natalie Portman teaches you on the Masterclass platform. Grow yourself and support Forgotten Wars by trying Masterclass for the year using the link in our show notes. Learn how to do what's important to you from the experts. Now, to our episode.
This is Forgotten Wars.
First, the Boers besieged Mafeking in the Cape Colony. Then they laid siege to Kimberley in the Cape Colony. On November 2nd, after ending General George White's career in humiliation on Mournful Monday, the Boers enveloped the Natal town of Ladysmith in another siege. Thousands of British soldiers and citizens holed up in Ladysmith, trapped by Joubert's invasion force. But more people were fleeing to Ladysmith during the siege. And these refugees were not British. Why? Why would people flee to a city under siege? A city whose water supply the Boers just severed? To answer this, I need to tell you a story of people so often left in the margins of the South African War's story. A story of people who bore more suffering than anyone during and after the South African War.
Under the British flag, you will have everything you desire. But that flag will continue to fly over the land.
Over the land, maybe. Over the people, never. You will see me in the field, fighting for our independence, long after you and your party who make war with your mouths have fled the country.
I don't think the Boers will have a chance.
Disarm your blacks. Act the part of a white man in a white man's war.
Civilized war is awful.
From the South African War's beginning, the British and the Boers had an agreement. This would be a white man's war. There would be no Africans fighting shoulder to shoulder with whites on the battlefield. No British bringing in Indian troops. At least on paper. Both Boers and Brits would break this agreement repeatedly by compelling or allowing Africans to take up arms beside them. There were reasons for this white man's war agreement. In 1899, about 1 million whites lived in South Africa compared to 4 million Africans, about 500,000 coloreds, and around 100,000 Asians, mostly Indians who lived in Natal. Before the war began, the British War Office held supreme confidence that they would easily overwhelm the Boer republics. Once the war began, the British didn't want to show weakness by bringing in numerous Indian soldiers they had available overseas. The British also had little confidence in the military prowess of South Africa's whites, many saying their ability was in a much lower stratosphere than their troops in India. The British also knew that using black soldiers would earn them bitter criticism from the white communities of Natal and the Cape Colony. These colonies' governments didn't want to give the impression that their independence and liberty depended on Africans, or any uncivilized people for that matter. For example, the Cape Colony raised hell in December of 1900 when the British informed them that Maori tribesmen, forming part of a New Zealand volunteer force, were about to sail for the Cape Colony. The hell-raising paid off. The Maoris were told to stay home. Many British and colonial officials also argued that Africans fought barbarically, and their barbarism would be impossible to contain once unleashed. The Boers had already spread themselves thinner across South Africa to protect against raids from neighboring African tribes who had scores to settle. Boers devoted 35 to 40% of their forces for the purpose of deterring African uprisings and putting them down if necessary. But with Africans outnumbering whites 4-1 across South Africa, 2-1 in the Orange Free State, and 4-1 in the Transvaal, and 10-1 in Natal, the Boers had even less hope of defeating the British if the British systematically mobilized these Africans against the Boers. And even if the Boers could have systematically armed Africans against the British, well, who was to say those same Africans wouldn't turn against their Boer bullies when the time was right? I implied earlier that this white man's war agreement was not exactly honored all the time. But before I get to that, we need to turn back time some years, beginning especially with the discovery of diamonds around 1870. The colonies and later the Boer republics used as much leverage as they could by law and violence to convert Africans to wage laborers, into tenants rather than controllers of ample tribal land. The rinderpest epidemic wiped out 90% of African cattle from 1896 to 1897, which drove even more Africans into the wage labor market. Ironically, converting Africans into wage laborers sometimes created unintended consequences. For example, when Sotho tribesmen bought thousands of rifles with their wages and tried to leverage their tribe's heavy gun ownership, war broke out between they and the Cape Colony. But colonial societies hadn't always aimed to avoid arming Africans. Historian Peter Warwick, in his critically acclaimed book, Black People in the South African War, helps us to tell much of today's story. When the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, first settled and expanded the Cape Colony, the company supplied soldiers for colonial defense. But by 1715, settlers, burghers, formed their first all-civilian commandos. The VOC nominated officers to lead these civilian commandos. As the Cape Colony continued to grow, so then did its defensive perimeter. The demand for frontier defenders grew so much that the burghers called on coloreds and Khoi to take up arms, to track down cattle raiders, to help defend the Cape Colony's frontier. Some commandos contained mostly Khoi and coloreds serving alongside some burghers. As a matter of fact, the call for blacks and coloreds to serve got so strong in 1778 that some recruiters complained that these non-whites were fleeing to the Namakwa country to evade serving. The coloreds and Khoi crucially contributed to Cape military efforts. Historian J.S. Murray says some remarkable things about how crucial these black recruits became to the Cape Colony. Quote, "When an enemy attack threatened or had taken place, all the colony's free inhabitants were liable to be called upon to join in its defense without distinction of color. Hottentots and colored people fought side by side with Europeans in all the Xhosa Wars on the eastern frontier from the 1780s to 1853. Indeed, it is no exaggeration to say that in the Xhosa Wars of 1846 to 1847 and 1850 to 1853, the colored people played a greater part in the defense of their colony than the European burghers, who responded badly to calls for service." End quote. There were colored soldiers in the Cape government pay from 1793 until 1870. Some colored soldiers did begin to fall short of what the Cape Colony government demanded in the 1830s. The Frontier War of 1835 saw both white and colored soldiers perform without glowing distinction like before. Colored soldiers mutinied and fired on their white officers in 1838. In 1851, some coloreds defected to rebels in the Cot River settlement. The Cape Colony decided to start phasing coloreds out of service after this rebellion. Mfangu refugees who had migrated from in and around Natal in the 1820s began to fill the colored shoes. But in 1878, Warwick writes that, quote, "The Burgher Forces and Levies Act for the first time made a clear distinction between blacks and whites in determining the eligibility of men to serve in the Cape's militia, blacks being assigned to a new special category of levies." End quote. So, Cape blacks basically got relegated to the status of octoroyers in the Boer republics. Speaking of the Boer republics, during the Great Trek, when thousands of Boers headed north from the Cape Colony because the British banned slavery, some coloreds came with the Boer trekkers and fought alongside the Boer trekkers against Zulu and other tribes that the Boer trekkers encountered. The Boer republics relied on their slaves, or slaves in nearly everything but name, to construct fortifications, herd horses and cattle, load rifles, and perform other labor and support duties on campaign. As the Boers and the British continued to subjugate many previously independent tribes throughout the 1800s, these whites allied with other tribes, like the Baralong and the Swazi, to help subjugate other tribes like the Zulu and Pedi. As Southern African settlers of both British and Boer stripes continued to turn against the idea of arming Africans for various reasons, another nasty theory helped reinforce this turn: social Darwinism. You can read a lot more about social Darwinism elsewhere, so I will only offer a quick and dirty explanation. Most of us know that the survival of the fittest plants and animals is something scientist Charles Darwin drove home in his 1859 book on the Origin of Species. Many scientists and intellectuals of the late 19th and early 20th century took this survival of the fittest concept and ran with it. They applied it to people. So basically, if your society and or race of people thrived economically and or militarily, this was because your race or society was inherently superior to other races. Some policymakers around the world took social Darwinist theory and put it into statute. They argued, why not speed up the elimination of the weak and the emergence of the fittest? For example, 32 U.S. states passed laws in the first half of the 20th century that resulted in the forced sterilization of more than 64,000 immigrants, people of color, mentally ill, and unmarried mothers. In Southern Africa, social Darwinism provided policymakers already looking for reasons to disarm and marginalize blacks with another intellectually respectable way to justify discrimination against blacks. Social Darwinism provided more cover for dark ideas about blacks. Dark ideas such as black African methods of warfare being barbaric, blacks preferring to slaughter women and children and the elderly rather than imprison them, blacks being impossible to calm down once aroused in warfare, blacks being impossible to restrain unless severely punished, and so on. All these cementing stereotypes stood in contrast with even recent reality. Anyone can try to argue that some of these stereotypes had some kernel of truth, but these stereotypes had no more truth than when wielded against whites in South Africa. We have alluded to the Rinderpest epizootic of 1896 to 1897 before. The 1896 to 1897 outbreak wiped out 90% of cattle in southern Africa and, unfortunately, forced many previously independent blacks into increasingly subservient roles to white landowners, thus helping to fulfill social Darwinism's false prophecies. However, the Basotho tribe stood as the best armed tribe on the eve of the South African War. You may remember that the Basuto tribe saw the writing on the wall in 1868. They and the Orange Free State fought some total wars just before 1868. Those wars will emerge in our story again later. After these wars, Basuto chief Moshushu asked the British for protection. The British annexed Basutoland, then turned administration over to the Cape Colony's governor in 1871. The Cape legislature then stripped criminal jurisdiction and the authority to allocate land from Basuto chiefs. The Basuto did not take this lying down. The Cape Colony passed severe black gun control laws in 1878. Then the Cape Colony tried to enforce these laws in April 1880 by disarming blacks within their jurisdiction. This meant war. The Basuto had been arming themselves for years, using the wages they'd earned working in Cecil Rhodes's diamond mines and even in gold mines far away. The gun war erupted from September 1880 until April 1881. The Basuto, with their breech-loading rifles, clashed with the Cape forces using Snyders and carbines that ultimately proved to be inferior. The war that one early historian of South Africa described as, quote, the most formidable attempt ever made by natives in South Africa to throw off European supremacy, ended inconclusively. But the Basuto kept their guns. These guns did grow more obsolete, though, as modern guns firing smokeless powder found their way onto southern Africa's battlefields. 3 years later, the Cape Colony ceded management of Basuto land back to the British. The British gave back the Basuto chiefs much of their autonomy. On the eve of the South African War, 30,000 well-armed Basuto had the potential to pick a side. Early in the war, the Basuto were described with a kernel of truth as the only unbroken tribe in southern Africa. But the British barred the Basuto and other blacks from joining their armed forces against the Boers, at least officially, for a while. For reasons we mentioned earlier this episode, the Boers and the British employed blacks primarily as scouts and in other unarmed auxiliary roles. And that isn't even counting all the Africans who took up arms against the Boers on their own accord. Both the Boers and the British accused each other repeatedly of systematically employing black people in their armed forces, not just as assistants, but as soldiers. By the war's end, somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 Africans did take up arms for the British Army. Blacks in Boer-controlled territory were forced into labor, often without pay. If you refused to provide your cheap labor, you were slapped with a 5-pound fine, imprisoned, or humiliated with 25 lashes. Some blacks, so desperate to get away from Boer overlords, fled into Ladysmith, even as the Boers began to besiege the town on November 2nd, 1899. As of this day, March 22nd, nearly 70 of you awesome listeners are tuning in each week. That number is slowly but steadily growing. I know many of you are at a time of life where you cannot just go and purchase something using our affiliate links. I get it. I myself can't afford to financially support every one of the podcasts I listen to. What would mean a lot to me if you're in that place where you can't necessarily buy stuff using our affiliate links, where you can't support us for $5 a month on Patreon, where you can't make one-time donations to us using our PayPal link, and where you can't buy any of our Forgotten Wars swag, is if you would do one, maybe two things that are free, but so important to helping this show go on. There are about half of you listening on Apple Podcasts. If you haven't yet given the show a 5-star rating, I'd beg of you to do that. That will take you less than 30 seconds now to go to the show on your podcast app and give us those 5 stars. Giving us a written review there would mean a lot as well. Now, whether or not you are listening on Apple Podcasts, there is something else I'd keep asking you to do. Share the show. The more you share the show, the more people who listen to the show. The more people who listen to the show, the more easily the show can be found. The more easily the show can be found, the more people who will try the show out. The more people who try the show out, the more people who can potentially buy from show sponsors, support us on Patreon or PayPal, and buy show swag. Then, the more likely I can keep telling important stories of forgotten wars for another season. It may not feel like a big deal to leave a 5-star rating and a written review, or to share the show, but please know that those things matter. Now, if you have the means to support the show financially in any way, all the different ways available will be listed in the show notes. And of course, they're always on the website, too. Finally, if you're wanting a version of the show without the commercials and these reminders to share, support, and rate the show, then would you consider donating $50 today using the show's PayPal link? Make a note with your donation that you want the commercial-free version of the show. And then, the commercial-free version of all this season's episodes will be yours. Now, back to our episode. Now, speaking of the besieged Ladysmith, where many mistreated blacks fled, Lieutenant General George White was not the only general ruining his career and reputation. Previously, I said that White's vacillating and sorry lack of strategic brilliance led him to eventually voluntarily sign his forces at Ladysmith up for a siege. The Boers kicked off this siege on November 2nd, 1899. While White knew his career was over as the siege of Ladysmith began, 68-year-old Piet Joubert acted unaware of the damage that devoting thousands of men to circling Ladysmith would do to the Boer cause. When Piet Joubert was appointed leader over forces invading Natal at the start of the war, many younger and more fiery leaders rolled their eyes. Historian Bill Nasson writes, quote, "The old general, or Krieger's dog, was judged at best irresolute and procrastinating, and at worst feeble and timid. There was particular contempt for his attachment to an afternoon nap and household comforts. He evidently believed in marching on his stomach, and on campaigns he routinely took along his spouse, Hendrina, accompanied by her servants and household cattle, partly to ensure that that stomach would not go empty." End quote. Hendrina Joubert is striking. Originally orphaned in the Cape Colony, Hendrina was adopted by a Botha family that made the great trek in the 1840s to Natal. Hendrina married Piet Joubert in 1851 and moved with him to the Transvaals, Wakkerstroom district in 1858. Unlike most women of her time, Hendrina accompanied Joubert on nearly all of his military campaigns, and not just in the South African War. Hendrina claimed in her memoir that during the First Boer War, she was the first one to spot the British on Machuba Hill, and she was the one to sound the alarm. What we do know more reliably is that Hendrina did nurse the wounded and grab provisions for the Commando. When she lost her husband, she devoted her energy to trying to help Boer women and children in concentration camps. When did she lose her husband? We will get to that soon. But now, Nasson continues a fair and scathing review of Piet Joubert's command. Quote, "But, as Ladysmith revealed, Joubert was no Napoleon, displaying a reach which constantly threatened to exceed the grasp of his armies. Despite holding almost all the trump cards, and despite full knowledge of where and when Ladysmith defenses were fairly thinly held, Joubert risked little in attempting to find a back door through which to overrun the town. It must be said that he was a mediocre commander who had probably got too far on." End quote. Nasson captures what most historians believe here. I will humbly submit something barely relevant to you right now. Joubert was obviously a poor commander. But had enough Boers listened to Joubert and his progressive party's call to extend the franchise more quickly to Uitlanders, South Africa may have avoided descending into this war with all of its carnage and all of its enduring collateral damage. But that aside, Joubert completely ruined Jan Smuts's grand strategy that called for a rapid invasion of Natal and commanding control of Natal's coast, especially the coastal city of Durban. Instead of moving on to Durban in force, Joubert devoted thousands of troops to sit idly around Ladysmith. Both sides settled into tit-for-tat shelling and small tit-for-tat attacks on each other's lines, not serious fighting. Many of the Boer rank and file complained in disbelief that Joubert would not dam up the nearby Klip River to flood Ladysmith into surrender. Deneys Reitz, one of the commandos in Natal at the time, complains about Joubert's decisions during the Battle of Ladysmith and the Siege of Ladysmith. Reitz writes, quote, "There was on this day, and for long after, much acrimonious discussion regarding the Commandant General's failure to pursue when the English turned back. And I was told by old Marula himself that when officers came to implore Piet Joubert to follow, he quoted the Dutch saying, 'When God holds out a finger, don't take the whole hand,' meaning that the Almighty had sufficiently aided us for one day, and that it did not behoove us to presume upon his bounty, a view which Isaac Malherbe said might be sound theology, but no good in making war." With that lack of vision that marred most of our doings in the earlier stages, we hailed the Ladysmith battle as a great victory, and we acted as if we had broken and defeated the enemy before us. It certainly was a notable success, but in the end, it would have been better for us had the British smashed our line that day, for our leaders would then have followed a better plan of campaign than sitting down to a prolonged and ruinous siege. Had the Boers made for the coast, instead of tying up their horsemen around towns that were of no value to them, the outcome of the war might have been different. But they sacrificed their one great advantage of superior mobility and allowed splendid guerrilla fighters to stagnate and demoralize in the monotony of siege warfare at a time when our only salvation lay in pushing to the sea." End quote. Instead, hundreds of Joubert's troops besieging Ladysmith fell into getting drunk, getting bored, and even getting back to their homes to check on their harvests. But this doesn't mean that Joubert or Louis Botha stayed put. Next week you'll hear about their run-in with Winston Churchill. Now, for those of you wondering, my son Evan is doing wonderful as of the day of this recording. Though my wife is 5'11", and I just shy of 6'3", and though Evan was born about a week late on October 27th, 2020, he weighed in at only 6 pounds 12 ounces. Evan's weight was only in the 17th percentile at one of his first doctor visits. Evan is continuing to fulfill my dreams by getting chubbier. I love chubby babies. As of this recording, he is up to the 37th percentile for weight, but takes after his dad in one way for sure. Evan's head is in the 62nd percentile. That's my boy. You sharing this show with others helps this show survive. You have strong odds to be rewarded for sharing the show through September 2021. If you would like to win your choice of either John Morley's vintage 2-volume biography on William Gladstone, or a brand new copy of Prescott Holmes's biography of Paul Creer, or a used copy of Robert Rotberg's biography of Cecil Rhodes, or a brand new copy of Deneys Reitz's Commando, a journal of the Boer War, or a used copy of Ian Smith's Origins of the South African War, then please share the Forgotten Wars podcast with others. Make that share personalized and authentic from you. Then, send me a picture of people responding to your share. That could be a picture of people thanking you for the share on Messenger, a picture of people liking and or commenting on your share of the show on Facebook, someone telling you in an email that they will check the podcast out, etc. You can even tag me in the Facebook post if you share on Facebook. I'm sharing instructions on how to take a screenshot to any of you who need those instructions in the show notes. 4 of you who send me those pics of people responding to your sharing of the show will be randomly chosen to receive one of these books. A 5th person, the person with the most people responding to their sharing of the podcast, will have their first pick of one of these books. This contest will run through September 2021. Send me your screenshots using the link I provide in this episode's show notes. Thank you.